everyone. Happy New Year. Can we still say Happy New Year this late into the month? Happy New Year's to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our fourth session, Learning Collaborative. Today, we're bringing some amazing powerhouse speakers. So I'm not going to hold you all further. Thank you all for joining. Just some quick reminders. Today's session will be recorded, so we encourage and empower you to share them with your teams. And as you get these amazing questions, write them down, and we will go through all the questions and answers towards the end of the presentation. So I won't hold you further. I'll pass this over to Brittany.
Hi, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's so nice to be with you all in this virtual space. My name is Brittany Davis, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm coming to you from Harlem in New York City. I am the Associate Director of Community Accountability and Engagement and work on the Gender and Family Justice team at the Center for Justice Innovation. My background is in social work, and I previously worked with survivors of trafficking in criminal legal settings through the Human Trafficking Intervention Courts in New York City. And I'm currently working to revamp that programming to become survivor leadership programming through one of our operating programs in the Bronx. I'm very, again, excited to be with you all today to talk about justice systems from the youth perspective, supporting young trafficking survivors with my amazing colleagues. And this is really to talk about a project that we had through the Office on Victims of Crime called the Child Witness Materials Project, where we were able to develop materials for young people to support them as they were going through the legal process. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Shashika Piligama, and I'm a Senior Program Manager at the Center for Justice Innovation. I'm currently calling in from Midtown Manhattan. I'm a social worker by background, very similar to Brittany as well, and I'm really excited to talk to you all about our project and ways that we can better support young trafficking survivors as they're going through the justice system. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us here today. We really appreciate it. And I'll pass over to Jasmine for introductions.
Perfect. I am Jasmine. I am on the West Coast, unlike my colleagues. I am with Saving Innocence, which is an organization that has a vision of eradicating exploitation and trafficking. Like my two colleagues, I also have a similar background in social work, and I have been able to implement and present a lot of this material that we will be showing you today, not only to different partners, but also to my dog, I wanted to say hi, but also to a lot of the youth that will be supporting or using this material.
So we can go ahead and transition to the slide deck. This is an exciting time for Shashika and I at the center. We just rebranded our organization. I think it was just last week, from the Center for Court Innovation to the Center for Justice Innovation. And this represents a small but pretty significant change in our work, and really actually more accurately reflects the work that we've been doing for the past 25 years, and really recognizes that, that justice extends beyond the legal systems. And we work closely with folks in the system as well as community members to achieve our mission, which is to work to achieve justice and equity, create safe, healthy, and thriving communities, and ultimately transform justice systems. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about how we do this through three major components of our work, through our research teams, where we perform rigorous research and data analytics, through our operating programs, which is really our direct service arm, and through expert assistance, where we work with folks and take the lessons learned from our research teams and our operating programs and share with the world and communities across the country different ways to enhance their own responses to a variety of different issues. Shashika and I work specifically on our Gender and Family Justice team, where we focus on issues related to domestic violence, stalking, teen dating violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I know Jasmine briefly introduced Saving Innocence, but I want to turn it back over to her just to talk a little bit more about the amazing work happening on the opposite coast of the country.
Yeah, so here on the West Coast in Los Angeles, we have the organization. It's a nonprofit called Saving Innocence. We have been around for about 20 years. We work on prevention, recovery, and restoration. We have partnerships with law enforcement, with the Department of Children and Family Services, as well as the Department of Los Angeles County Probation, to help and support and just put hands on all the youth that kind of come through the system or that are not yet identified in the system, to help and support them if they have been a victim or have been impacted by exploitation and trafficking. A lot of our work is advocacy work. So advocacy work, mentorship, as well as help with court testifying. And we can you can see how that blends into this material that we're going to be presenting today, and why it was super helpful for a lot of the kids that we serve out here in Los Angeles.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. So we'll be with you for a little while, I guess the next 90 minutes or so. And I just like to start off by outlining our learning objectives. So as a result of this training, you will be better able to discuss how young trafficking survivors experience the legal system, including young Black trafficking survivors, utilize court support strategies, describe the center's specialized child witness support materials for trafficking survivors, and you're going to get a chance to see some of the images from it, and we're going to give you QR codes and links, so you'll be able to use them with your young people as well, and then being able to utilize these child witness support materials for trafficking survivors. And we'll be engaging in some interactive activities and discussions as we move through, because we also want to learn from you and the ways that you've been supporting young people in your own communities. So if we go to the next slide, I know as part of your wonderful work with Youth Collaboratory, you've participated in some grounding conversations around trafficking. So we're not going to go too deeply into this, but did just want to provide a little bit of an overview. And according to the National Human Trafficking Hotline data report from 2022, there were 10,583 unique cases of potential human trafficking that were reported in 2020. So when you break that down a little bit further, 28% of victims in sex trafficking situations were minors, and 4.6% were foreign nationals. And I know we're not necessarily talking about labor trafficking under this particular grant, but do want to name this as well. 15.4% of victims in labor trafficking situations were minors, and 50.4% were foreign nationals. So as we move through our presentation, we'll share that we did provide and create materials for both survivors of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, but today's focus will really be on the materials that we developed for survivors of sex trafficking. I also just wanted to note these statistics that we had obviously might not necessarily be representative of the totality of human trafficking that's happening in our communities. We know that there are a lot of barriers to reporting and identifying, but just want to commend all of you all for the important work that you've been doing in your communities of training folks on how to identify trafficking survivors and serving those folks in your community. So thank you for the work that you're doing. So we know that trafficking is happening in our communities, but now we want to talk a little bit about how that relates to the legal system. And there are a few ways that young people can be involved in the legal system. So they can be involved as a survivor defendant. They can be involved as a victim or witness on a criminal case or in child welfare proceedings. And this slide really just outlines that there has been legislation over the years to really prevent survivors from being arrested and charged as a result of their victimization. As a reminder, if you think back to the training that I'm sure you got from Youth Collaboratory, according to the federal definition, any young person under 18 who is engaging in commercial sex would meet the definition of trafficking. And there are safe harbor laws also in many states across the country that are really supposed to protect children from unjust criminalization by preventing young people from being charged with prostitution and hopefully directing them to specialized services. But we know, unfortunately, that that's not necessarily a foolproof system. Many youth are still being directed to a juvenile legal process as a result of their trafficking experiences. And we also know that many youth are arrested for other status or criminal offenses. So things such as truancy, running away, theft, assault, and drug possession sales. And often these status offenses or offenses are directly related to their trafficking experience as well. There was a study done in 2016 that showed that 91% of trafficking survivors reported being arrested. And when you break that down a little bit further, I think it was 41% of respondents reported being arrested as minors. So it's just important to recognize that this is still happening to young people across the country. I also mentioned again that folks can be identified as a victim or a witness on a criminal case, and then also involved in child welfare proceedings, where we know that 50 to 90% of children who are victims of child sex trafficking have been involved in the child welfare system. You can go to the next slide here. So we partnered with Youth Collaboratory on this grant, and a component of their approach that I think is super important is the way that they are intentionally centering Black girls in the prevention and intervention of trafficking. Since we know, and the research shows, and our work with folks across the country shows that Black girls are disproportionately impacted by both trafficking and the legal system. We know that racism and sexism, oppression and poverty, and all of these things, and the intersection of these things as well, really fuel human trafficking, and communities that experience discrimination are more at risk. So we just wanted to highlight some of these statistics that that really highlight the racial disparities in sex trafficking and juvenile justice. So one, for example, is in Louisiana, where 49% of sex trafficking survivors are Black girls, while they make up roughly only 25% of the population. Similarly, in King County and Washington, 52% of trafficking survivors are Black and 84% are female, but Black girls comprise 1.1% of the general population. And this last statistic is a little dated, but the FBI did report back in 2017 that 53% of juvenile prostitution arrests are of Black children. So again, you're seeing the ways that both trafficking and the legal system are disproportionately impacting Black girls. So if we go to the next slide, we want to take an opportunity to hear from you all about what thoughts and feelings might young trafficking survivors have about the legal system, specifically Black girls who are navigating the legal system. You heard some of those statistics, and I know you're working with folks across the country, so we would love to hear your perspective. And we're actually going to do a little interactive activity for this. So I'm going to drop a link into the chat, and I'd love for you all to hop into this Jamboard. And we're going to get the screen share. Look at how seamless that was. That was amazing. The Jamboard up here. And if you look on the left-hand corner, there's a little icon there that looks like a Post-it note. So I'd love for you all just to take the Post-it note, click it, and just put some of your thoughts and feelings on there. Shashika and I were just at an in-person meeting last week, and we decorated the whole entire office with all of these Post-its. And so we're trying to get you all to be doing the same thing here virtually. So if you all want to just take maybe 3 minutes or so just to think about what thoughts and feelings might young trafficking survivors have about navigating the legal system. Great, already seeing a big one on there. It's as if you had seen my next 2 slides, which are going to talk a little bit about that. Let's keep it coming. Let's see if we can get a few more. Unsupported, definitely. And wow, you did a text box. You did something different. I love it. All right, I'm going to give it maybe 30 more seconds to 60 seconds before we wrap up and transition back to the conversation. Overwhelming, definitely. Here we go. All these are coming in now. Just needed a little minute to think. And I love the use of the different colors too. I didn't teach y'all how to do that, but you figured it out, which is great. All right. So these are well, they're not necessarily great things that are happening, but they're great that you're able to identify the ways that young people might be feeling as they're navigating the legal system. We know the legal system is incredibly confusing. So when you talk about, feeling confused, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of legal jargon that's shared and not necessarily described in youth-friendly language. Mistrust makes a lot of sense. Feeling overwhelmed by all of the new information, the people that they have to meet, not understanding the roles of the different practitioners. Having a lack of empathy from the providers makes a lot of sense. We know that unfortunately, A lot of them might not be operating from a trauma-informed lens or from an anti-oppressive lens, or really knowledgeable about positive youth development, right? And all of those things can impact the way that they show up with youth. And afraid, that makes a lot of sense. It can be a really scary experience to have to navigate and move through the legal system. So thank you all so much for participating in that. We can go back to the other slide deck and just highlight. You've got most of them actually. Which is great, but just want to highlight a few of the other ones. Yes, thanks, Shashika. So they might have prior system involvement, can lead to mistrust. I think one of you mentioned that on the board. We also know that, when we think about Black girls in particular, that they can face blatant oppression, not only in the juvenile system, but also in society, right? There's been research that really talks about adultification, or the idea that, I think the research shows that even as young as 5 years old, Black girls are seen as more knowledgeable about adult topics, less in need of that support, less innocent, and older than their actual age, right, than their white counterparts. And we also know that viewing you through that particular lens might cause folks to misunderstand trauma responses, right? And that leads to the idea that punishment is preferable to support, right? So you might have youth displaying behaviors, and practitioners might think that it's quote unquote aggressive, or quote unquote fast, or quote unquote a problem child, right? And not necessarily seeing the ways that their actions might be trauma responses. We also know that it can be really a traumatizing experience when youth and young people, and adults in general too, have to, share their story and share a detailed account of what happened to them to multiple different strangers, right? Just sharing the most, scary things that have happened to you to multiple people that you don't even know. That can be a really hard thing for folks to have to move through. And then, of course, the process is unpredictable, and it can be really long. If we go to the next slide, this brings up some things that you also mentioned, the rampant confusion and misinformation. We talked a little bit about how practitioners might lack that empathy, and then also lack training in operating with a culturally humble mindset, or utilizing positive youth development strategies. And then, of course, they might feel coerced and used by the system, and have limited control. So if we go to the next slide, we don't necessarily have time to go through all of these different strategies, but these are some tips for working with young survivors of trafficking. Many of these you might be using in your own work with young people already. A lot of them are traditional kind of engagement strategies, but just wanted to highlight a few of them. I think when you're working with young people, particularly when a case is involved, you want the case to go their way, and sometimes it can be easy to mistakenly, focus so much on the case and not focus on them, right? You want to embrace their humanity and remind them that they are more important than the case, right? That their life is more important than the case, right? So we want to meet their basic needs instead of jumping right into the case conversation. Like, how did you sleep last night, right? How do you have everything that you need? Do you need clothes? Do you need food? How are people treating you where you're staying, right? Are they using your correct pronouns? So really trying to meet their basic needs and kind of embrace their humanity. Another big one here also is just building agency. And with that, really trying to be mindful of the different power dynamics that might exist, right? So there are always power dynamics that exist between individuals. So you think of, you as the adult and them as the young person. You think of you as a service provider and them as the service recipient. If your role is that you are in some sort of kind of state or governmental role, kind of the power that comes with that versus the power of not kind of operating or working within that particular organizational structure, those power dynamics matter. And so particularly when we're thinking and working with young people who have, survived trafficking, who have survived kind of power over dynamics, we want to move to build their agency. So when you're talking to them, trying to prioritize their best interests and trying to prioritize their own needs as defined by them. So what do they need to feel safer when you're thinking about their safety plan or thinking about different things that might happen as the course of what they're going through in the legal system. So we'll stop there for these, but definitely feel free to ponder what are some other kind of ways that you can operationalize or practically use some of these suggestions when working with young trafficking survivors. And the other one that I'll add here too is, of course, encouraging advanced training for practitioners. And so this, reminds me of just kind of thinking back about your larger community response to trafficking, right? Is everyone trained on it? Can everyone understand risk factors and understand how to identify? So just making sure that advanced training opportunities are available for other practitioners in your community to make sure that you all can put forth your best work and best engagement. So if we go to the next slide, I know Shashika and Jasmine are going to talk a lot more about the child witness materials. And I think on the left, that might actually be, I think those are images from the materials. So you'll get to see some of those other images in a moment. But these are just some of the goals of legal system education and support, which can be really important and empowering for young people. So we do this to reduce their distress and to avoid re-traumatization or to reduce re-traumatization. To improve the quality of their testimony and to create a more positive and empowering experience for them. And so now I think as I move through, we're just going to share a little bit more of the strategies that we were able to come up with as a result of this collaborative work where and Shashika is going to get into this, so I don't want to spoil it, but talk to a lot of practitioners and talk to a lot of stakeholders in order to develop these materials and develop the accompanying resources that have a lot of these strategies on here. But here are some of them. So consulting with prosecutors about their cases. So in the two stories that we're going to talk about today, in the first one, the young person's defense attorney was consulting with prosecutors, especially when she learned of the young person's trafficking background, and that was able to help her case. In the other story, the young person met with the prosecutor and the advocate to learn about, how to testify, to practice cross-examination and things of that nature. I think what's really important when thinking about and navigating these very confusing ways of navigating the system is anticipating and addressing emotional issues, right? So the young people might have to detail their story again, might see things that remind them of their experience. So really taking the time to slow down and help them to identify particular trauma reminders and empowering them to learn, teaching relaxation and coping skills. So this could be breathing exercises, this could be moving your body, this could be journaling, mindfulness, whatever is going to work for them. I remember when we did some youth focus groups on relaxation and coping skills, I remember them saying like, it needs to be something other than yoga, right? I think when we think about these coping skills, yoga often comes up, and that can be great for a lot of people, but sometimes it isn't the best fit for everyone. And the young people really wanted to make sure that coping strategies that were included were inclusive, right? And included other things than yoga. So just being mindful and creative and finding strategies that actually work with the young person who's in front of you. Court preparation and accompaniment. I know Jasmine talked a little bit about how they do that a lot in their role at Saving Innocence, and we try to reflect that in these materials. So this could be bringing the young person to the courtroom before the proceedings to familiarize themselves with the room, right? Just trying to increase comfort and familiarity, right? The defense sits on this side, the prosecution sits on this side. This is where the judge is going to sit. These are the roles of all of these different people, and also accompanying them as you are able. And then of course, processing outcomes is really important. So telling, and teaching in preparation of the different outcomes that may happen, of course, making no promises for what might happen, but then also processing, afterwards. And of course, during this time as well, really helping the young people to identify the different strengths that they have been able to exhibit to help them to get through this particular process. So that was a little bit about some of these legal system support strategies. And we have another just poll question for you all that we can do. Love for you all to participate. Should young survivors testify in criminal cases? So the poll is just started and we will see the results in maybe 30 seconds to a minute. So your options are yes, no, or it depends. All right, so 100% it depends. Great. So if we go to the next slide here, it kind of demonstrates that it depends, right? So it needs to be determined on a case-by-case basis, right? So we do have some pros. It can be an empowering experience, like an opportunity for the young person to tell their story, to stand up for themselves. And then you also have the reality coming in a little bit, right? The state may be unable to prosecute without the young person as their witness. But then also we know that there are a lot of cons, right? It can be re-traumatizing, distressing, confusing, all of those things that you put up on the Jamboard, right? All of those things play in here. There can be repeated delays. It's a lengthy process. So all of those things kind of demonstrate that it depends. On the next slide, we'll highlight how if someone is going to testify, that they can utilize what's called the strategic sharing process. And I believe this kind of comes out of the foster care movement. I think Casey Family Programs put this together when I think young people were either participating in some sort of legal proceeding, or also maybe just preparing to tell their story for advocacy efforts. So it can be really important, again, to make sure that the young person understands the goal of talking about their experience, right? So why do they need to do this? What is the purpose of this? As well as, again, who's going to be in the room and what is their particular role? It's important to talk about some of those risks and benefits that we just identified in the previous slide. It can be helpful to practice what this opportunity to testify might look like, right? So practice your direct testimony, practice the cross-examination, and really prepare young people for the adversarial nature of that cross-examination, where it is the defense's role to kind of poke holes in that story. And if you don't prepare someone for that, that can be a really challenging experience to go through. Really breaking down with young people what details they do need to share, what details they don't need to share. And again, this idea really of identifying different trauma reminders and developing a safety plan and providing that space and support for them to debrief after they participated in that process. If we go to the next slide, here are just some considerations for consultations with prosecutors. So again, we talked about before how it depends if young people should participate in testifying. And what you need to consider is the impact on the young person's symptoms and their healing journey, right? You don't necessarily want to, or you don't want to cause more harm. And this could be an opportunity for advocacy. Also, just exploring the need for special accommodations. What is going to make the young person feel safer in participating in this process? Talking with the prosecutors about implementing trauma-informed interviewing techniques. We talked a little bit about some of those court preparation strategies, and of course providing crisis support before, during, and after the interviews is important as well. So this is another discussion question for you all, and love your participation in the chat if you're able. So how do you currently support young survivors as they navigate the justice system? Do any of the things that we've talked about resonate with you? Are you doing them, or you have other strategies? We'd love to hear and learn from you. So I'll take maybe a minute or two to see what folks throw into the chat. What strategies do you use to currently support your young survivors as they navigate the justice system? Continuing support to youth and their families. Great, thank you, Amber. And can you just follow up in that? Like, what does that support look like? Could you give us an example of what that support might look like?
That support might look like calls at 4 o'clock in the morning. They may just need someone to talk to. It may be parent-child conflict because the parent doesn't necessarily know how to deal with that youth. So we make sure we have parent support for them. Mm-hmm. It could be absolutely anything. There's always a staff available.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So being available sometimes at those early hours in the morning, making yourself available and providing that that support for the parents as well, right? That's great. Thank you. Any other suggestions or any other things that y'all are doing in your own communities? I see something else coming through from Amari. For my organization, we give our youth the opportunity to attend their hearings depending on how old they are. So they can have an insight and have a voice. It also teaches them protocol of how matters are handled in their court system. That's fabulous. As we've talked about before, the court system can be so confusing. So providing them opportunity to see it, with their own eyes and to ask questions, to get those questions answered is really, really wonderful. And again, I really love how you're centering that that ability to build agency, right? So they're participating in this so they can have insight and have a voice in the process. So thank you so much for that. You guys are from Boston, it looks like. Thank you, Amari. Anybody else? All right, well, definitely feel free to keep putting things in the chat, but we're going to just move on and highlight just a few more slides of what court support strategies can look like throughout the process, during the process, and after the process. So these ones are throughout the process, and we've talked a little bit about this, but working with youth to identify supports, right? And when we talk about this, we're not talking about the supports we think they might need, or that's an important consideration, but really working with youth to identify what is going to be helpful for them at each stage of the process, right? At the testifying process, if it comes to be that they need to be placed into a foster care placement, what are the things that they need that are going to help them feel supported? And really to try to avoid services that feel coercive, right? We're trying to build agency there and allow them to provide insight into what's going to be helpful as they are navigating this situation. Highlighting strengths, both verbally and writing can be helpful. So think of those Post-its that we just put up on the Jamboard, writing them physically down on sticky notes, right? What are the strengths that they're exhibiting throughout this process? And in here, we also like to talk about leveraging culture as a strength. Maybe there is a cultural value related to truth seeking or justice that's really important to them. How can you infuse that in your conversations? Maybe there's a cultural hero or mentor or community member who's really, really important to them. Who exhibits being brave or something like that. How can you talk about that? Maybe there's a particular cultural kind of a memento or thing that they can hold as they go up to the testifying stand. We know we've talked to young people who've held stones or held something that's important to them to help calm their nerves. Maybe that's something that you can leverage and bring to part of the conversation. So really thinking about culture as a strength instead of as a deficit, and using it to continue to engage with the young person and give them some solutions for how they're navigating this process. We already talked a little bit about preparing for the adversarial nature of the legal process. So really that preparation for cross-examination, the whole nature in general, but that's a distinct area that you can work on. And again, just really teaching and developing the coping strategies that are going to work for them, right? Not the ones that work for us, not the yoga necessarily, but the ones that are going to work for them. So if you go to the next slide, so these are some things before testifying. We've talked a little bit about exploring possible triggers and helping them manage them. Again, providing that space. I think Amber talked about it, that early morning call to kind of process what's happening, providing that space for them to talk about their feelings and ask questions. One thing that we didn't talk about yet is discussing clothing options for court. So we want, the clothing options to be court appropriate, and we want them to be comfortable, something that the young person is going to feel comfortable kind of moving around in and participating in the proceeding. So just having conversations about what that might look like. Also advising them to pack an overnight bag if that's something that's needed, if there's needing to be travel. And then I think Amber or Amari and Amber, you may both have talked about this, but working with caregivers so that they also understand the legal process and answer any questions and address their needs. And they might need their own advocate because sometimes there's a conflict of interest that may occur. So just definitely making sure that they have someone to attend to them, and someone else is putting full attention on the young person as they're the ones who are, navigating this process fully. And finally, just some strategies for after the court, and where possible within the bounds of your role, you want to continue to provide support for the young person. Again, trying to identify the strengths that have gotten them through and the ways that they've been resilient and really showed up throughout the process. Updating those safety plans as needed. We know safety plans are kind of an open process and can be updated as things need to change, and also trying to provide connections to healing opportunities and culturally affirming healing opportunities. This could be therapy, this could be support groups and resources. We want to empower them. So educational resources, career development resources, life skills resources. So making those connections for them after court so they can continue in their healing journey. So that was a lot of just background. And now we're going to transition to talk about the amazing materials, and you'll get a glimpse of what they actually look like, and you'll learn how to actually use them with the young people in your community. So I'll pass it to Shashika.
Great. Thank you so much, Brittany, for all that background information. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about our project, and it takes a lot of the learnings and the discussion points that we've gone through already. So we have a project called the Child Witness Materials Development Project, and we're funded by the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime. We just refer to them as OVC to make it easier. And basically, exactly what you already discussed and what Brittany covered in her earlier slides, we've got a really strong identification that children who've been victimized or exposed to violence or witnessed something that might have happened, they often have to interact with very adult-oriented systems. I don't know about you all on the call, but as a social worker, even though I'm part of this system, I find it really confusing, and sometimes I don't know what's going on or what the next process might be or what these terms might be or what's going to be happening next. And so you can only imagine for a child or for a young person how confusing and overwhelming it might be for them. And I know a lot of you already identify those key terms when we were doing the Jamboard. And then another strong thing is that sometimes going through the experience can often cause re-traumatization or distress. In doing this project, we did look through a lot of research, and some of the research indicated that sometimes, not always, but sometimes even the act of going through the criminal justice system, that in of itself can often be more traumatizing than the actual incident itself. And that's saying a lot, right? So obviously we do have this very imperfect system that's incredibly adult-oriented, incredibly overwhelming and confusing. And so we really do need to do something to help children that unfortunately do have to navigate these systems. So there's very much this need for trauma-informed and child-friendly support. And so OVC, a couple of years back, I want to say it's about 2014, 2015, but don't quote me on that, but they underwent this huge initiative called Vision 21, and it's basically taking a full deep dive and thorough analysis of the current justice system and seeing how we can better support victims that are going through the US justice system with a focus on children in particular. And in doing that analysis, OVC also looked at some of their old publications. So they had one called BJ Goes to Court, which is from the 90s. So as you can all imagine, it's quite outdated now. Some of the terminology and the way that it explains things are very much outdated and just not user-friendly in any way for children. And so OVC really wanted to put out new materials or new support educational materials that could really help children better understand and better navigate the justice system if they happen to have to interact with them. And so at the Centre for Justice Innovation, we were formerly known as Centre for Court Innovation as of last week, as Brittany mentioned, but we were really grateful to receive a grant from OVC to create materials for children that might have to interact with the criminal, legal or child welfare systems. And we created them and finished creating those materials back in 2020. And Saving Innocence was also a partner on them, which Jasmine is representing. And we created special materials for children ages 2 to 6, 7 to 12, and 13 to 18. And they cover a lot of the information that you all already identified that's really important, and the strategies that Brittany also highlighted in terms of like preparation for court, testifying, whether a child should testify or not, who the practitioners are, and what they might expect to experience if they're going through these systems. Now, something that we really quickly identified is that while the general child witness materials are really thorough and very extensive and do a deep dive in the criminal legal system, they don't necessarily address the needs of trafficking survivors. As you all are professionals and have a wealth of knowledge in this room, I don't need to go too much into this, but as we all know, the experiences of young trafficking survivors are very unique and differ quite greatly to those stories of other people that might have experienced other victimization or violence. And some examples, the dynamics of exploitation are often very different. We've found that young trafficking survivors may have experienced other traumatic events in their lifetime, in their younger years, not just the incident of trafficking, and it can often be compounded by the trafficking experience. We're also finding that the relationship with the exploiter is often very unique. Sometimes the exploiter might be a family member, or it might be a friend, or it might be someone that the young person identifies as their romantic partner. And so as you can imagine, that's very complex, right? Someone is exploiting you, but at the same time, you deeply care and may even love this person. And so there is that deep, complex dynamics that needs to be unpacked. And then as Brittany also mentioned, we do find that unfortunately, some young trafficking survivors are often interacting with the criminal legal system, not just as a victim, but also unfortunately often as a defendant. So we are finding that with safe harbor laws and with the enactment of federal law and the recognition that a child under 18 cannot consent to sexual activity for commercial purposes, unfortunately, we are finding that some few cases of them being arrested for prostitution-related charges, or maybe they might be arrested for associated charges regarding their trafficking experience. And so that places them in a very unique experience to interact as a dual victim defendant. And then we're also just finding that there's not a lot of support for young trafficking survivors that really provides that education about what the justice system is, what their rights are, who they might interact with, and how they can kind of overcome and navigate their way through this system. And so we were really grateful to receive an additional grant from OBC in 2018 to develop specialized materials for trafficking survivors. And so we underwent a process to develop these materials, which follows a very similar process to our other projects. Basically, that involved forming a stakeholders group of national experts and providers across the entire United States. We did a national needs assessment to really understand what the needs of trafficking survivors are and what should go into our materials. We then went through a process of developing the content and style. As Brittany mentioned, a lot of the images that are throughout this presentation come directly from the materials themselves, and I'll go into them in more detail. We pilot tested them with young people across the country just to make sure that what we've kind of drafted feels relatable and relevant to them. And then we asked peers, such as yourself and Nicole, to review them as well, to see from a peer practitioner perspective what they think about the materials. And then OBC, as well as really high-level federal agencies, reviewed the materials. And then we took all of this feedback and information to really inform the final products. And so here's a list of our partners and stakeholders. I won't go through them one by one, but you can see that they do come from a range of different organizational backgrounds and from across the country. And as we mentioned, we're so grateful to have Jasmine here from Saving Innocence, who've been one of our key partners over on the West Coast. So as I mentioned, we did do a huge national needs assessment that was completed at the end of, towards the end of 2019. And that involved reviewing existing materials. So what's out there to support trafficking survivors currently? What is the research telling us? We also did interviews and focus groups with practitioners and survivors across the country. We also did an online survey, which we received 73 responses from. And then from all of that information, we were able to compile a report to identify key findings and then recommendations for the development of the materials. And so a lot of the findings are very similar to what Brittany already laid out at the beginning of this presentation. So just to kind of uplift them and reiterate those key findings, one thing that really stood out is that trafficking affects everyone and anyone. It doesn't matter the background of the person, it doesn't matter age, geographical location, country of origin. Trafficking does affect everybody. However, having said that, we did find, and as the data suggests that Brittany illustrated earlier, is that Black and brown girls are disproportionately affected, and they do seem to be experiencing sex trafficking the most frequently. And so that was something that we really wanted to take into consideration when developing these materials and making sure that we were centering those experiences and being very sensitive to that. Another key finding, which I'm sure is not surprising to you all, is that the majority of labor trafficking cases for young people is sex trafficking. However, labor trafficking is most definitely prevalent in this country. What we did find is that it often falls under the radar. It's not as easy to identify sometimes. Sometimes a child or a young person might be experiencing it, but it doesn't present itself in a way that might be easily recognizable. And oftentimes it's not even coming into any contact with the justice system whatsoever. However, as I mentioned, it is very much prevalent, and so it is something we really wanted to focus on as well. As Brittany already talked about, we did find that trafficking survivors are often experiencing a lot of trauma and might exhibit behaviors or symptoms associated with trauma that can often be mislabeled as really negative things, right? As anger or belligerence or non-cooperation. But their trauma responses. These young people have gone through very traumatic and difficult circumstances, and so it's completely understandable how their responses or symptoms may be. And it's just very disappointing that they're often relabeled or mischaracterized. Language was a very important thing that came out of our findings in terms of using non-blaming language, very empowering language, and language that somewhat mirrors what young people would use themselves, that felt relatable to them. As you all already identified, caregiver information is important. We know that none of us, we don't exist in a vacuum, a single entity. We come from our own networks of friends, family, support. And so it's really important that we're also kind of equipping the people around the young person with information about what the justice system is and what they might expect. So caregiver information is really important. And then as well as the practitioners, so people such as ourselves, equipping them with the right knowledge and education about how best to support young trafficking survivors really came through in our needs assessment. And so those key findings really inform some of the recommendations. We've already spoken a lot about this, but wanting to make sure that we consider the added layers of marginalization that Black and Brown girls in particular experience with the justice system. Often a lot of mistrust, as you all mentioned in our earlier Jamboard activity. Also, maybe sometimes they might experience negative associations, might experience sexism or racism by people working within the system that are supposedly there to protect them, and then just being really sensitive to not making sure we don't portray any negative stereotypes. So those are things that we really needed to take into consideration in the development of our materials. As I mentioned, language was something that was really important, reflecting the diverse identities of young trafficking survivors. So as I mentioned, it was very clear that trafficking happens to everybody, all different people, irrespective of race, gender identity, sex background, geographical location, country of origin. So we really wanted to make sure that we were representing that in our materials as well. And then we really wanted to make sure, and a key recommendation was equipping young people to kind of cope with the trauma. So Brittany spoke a lot about this, but this is basically about equipping young people with the skills to kind of navigate and go through these difficult experiences of interacting with the justice system. So we're very mindful that we of course can't remove the experience that has happened to them, but we can equip them with the skills to maybe move past this experience, to help them process what is going on, and then hopefully look forward to the future. And then the last point that I just wanted to mention is just regards to being really realistic with what the justice system is like. So a huge recommendation that we received is that the justice system is not perfect by any means, right? And while we strive for to be more trauma informed, that's why we do these trainings and we do all of these kind of gatherings together, we do know that not everyone is going to be that trauma informed. And chances are that a young person may come across someone that's not very trauma informed, may not be very sensitive to their experiences, and may not treat them with the deepest respect that they deserve. And so a key recommendation that we received was that we're not doing anyone any favors if we portray only the best case scenario or the most trauma informed approaches. And so we should be very realistic with our materials. So that's something that we really wanted to take on board and carry through with some of the interactions in our stories. So I'll just move us on because I am mindful of the time. But just in terms of developing the materials, we partnered with design agencies, Center for Urban Pedagogy, they're based in Brooklyn, and then another agency, Alternate History Comics, that are based in Toronto, but they do work throughout the United States. We convened discussions with stakeholders, partners, and expert practitioners from all across the country, including those that work on labor trafficking, because we knew that that was an area that we wanted to develop more expertise and more knowledge on. And then we also worked with a group of survivor advocates and lived experience experts that work very closely with the centre. And we wanted to get their insight into story development, their experiences, whether what we're drafting felt relatable to them. And they really formed a key role in terms of developing the materials. So we're very grateful for their support. So as I mentioned, once we drafted the materials, we did pilot test them around the country. Unfortunately, November 2020 was the peak of COVID, so we were not able to go around the country as originally planned, but we did a lot of virtual sessions, kind of like how we're doing it now. We met, we were very grateful in spite of the COVID limitations to be able to meet with our 17 young survivors in one-on-one sessions around the country and 17 practitioners in focus groups. And we really wanted to ensure that we had as much regional and geographical diversity as possible. So we're grateful that we were able to speak to people from all across the country. And this is a really key part of the development because we really wanted to get insight from young survivors themselves on whether they thought the materials we drafted were relatable, whether the content felt realistic to them, the characters, what they look like, did it feel appropriate, was there anything insensitive, was there anything missing? And we really took a lot of time to unpack the feedback and information that we got from them to inform our final products. As I mentioned, we also did our concurrent or simultaneous expert peer review, where we asked expert practitioners to complete an online survey and review the materials. And we're really grateful to hear that over 82% of them said that they would recommend the materials to colleagues and peers in the fields. So that was very encouraging. So just to give an overview of what these materials are that we're speaking about. So basically they comprise of 3 graphic novels. There's Zoe's story, Jamie's story, and Sergio's story. For the purpose of our presentation today, we won't be going too much into Sergio's story because that focuses heavily on labor trafficking, but Zoe's story and Jamie's story is more about sex trafficking. All 3 of the stories feature a number of different coping activities. So I know Brittany spoke about this earlier, and as we mentioned, it was just a very key recommendation to make sure that we were imparting as much tools as we could to young people to help them process and kind of move through what they are feeling and really acknowledge the strong feelings that they would be experiencing as well, going through these really difficult and overwhelming systems. And then providing alternatives to just yoga, right? So there are a couple of different activities that we showcase. Not all of them will feel comfortable for a young person, but we're hoping that at least one of them will. And then, as I mentioned, we did speak and work with a lot of survivors that we have close relationships with, and we actually were really grateful to be able to take some of their quotes and real life experiences and interject them into the stories to kind of validate what the story is talking about. So the story in of itself is fiction, but then we have a real life quote, an excerpt from a survivor that really kind of reiterates what the story is talking about and lets the young person know, hey, I went through this and you can go through it too, and we can get past it. And then we talk a lot about rights and roles and who practitioners are throughout the justice system and explain who they are. So when we did pilot testing, we got such great feedback and we wanted to share with you a few quotes that we got. And so this is one that we got from one young person who says, I was able to relate to all 3 stories, surprisingly a lot, like whether it was now or back when I was younger. And I wasn't expecting that. And we just were so grateful for that quote because, you know, when we draft these materials, we don't know if they're going to be a hit or a miss. And for us to be able to meet with young people who actually felt that it was relatable to them, that really encouraged us to just develop them as much as we could and get them to a really great place at the end. So I'll just start off by explaining a little bit more about the actual story. So we've got Zoe's story. Zoe is a 14-year-old female identifying young person. She experiences sex trafficking by the person that she identifies as her boyfriend. Boyfriend is strategically put in inverted commas because we acknowledge that that's who Zoe identifies as her boyfriend. So we do want to acknowledge that, but we also know from the practitioner end that that is the exploiter. So again, traversing that fine line of language, what feels comfortable and relatable for the young people, but still honoring and respecting the true situation. So Zoe was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention facility, and through that she interacts with various justice system players, including probation, lawyer, social worker, and she attends a support group, and through that she shares her experience with what happened to her and how she's kind of overcome and gone through her experience. As I mentioned, all of the stories have different coping activities, and they all at the very end have a taking care of me checklist. This again came from the young people. This was a recommendation from them. To Brittany's point, not everyone loves yoga, not everyone loves deep breathing. So we wanted to make sure that we included a list of other recommendations that young people themselves had suggested to give an array of different coping activities that might feel comfortable. So these are some excerpts from Zoe's story. At the beginning, we can see she's at a support group. She's feeling really nervous to share her story about what happened to her. It's the first time she's doing that in a public space. You can see that the other support group members, they are of diverse backgrounds. We spoke a lot to our designers and illustrators and had just so many one-on-one sessions with them about how best to kind of represent the characters in the stories. And we hope we did it justice. Of course, there's always room for improvement, but we hope we did our best to really show diversity in the cast. So Zoe's talking about her experience about the time that she was arrested and placed in a juvenile detention facility. So we can see, of course, the range of emotions that come with that. She had to attend court at the arraignment. And then unfortunately, the judge ends up keeping her longer in the detention facility because they're concerned about Zoe not having a place to stay, and that the nature of the charges that she's brought in on, they are worried she'll be at a flight risk. So you can see Zoe obviously is very distressed about that. Zoe ends up talking to a social worker, and through that interaction, we kind of start to see and unpack what's happening to Zoe. So Zoe talks a bit more about the person she identifies as her boyfriend, what he asked her to do, how she makes her money. And through that, we kind of get a sense that something's really going on for Zoe. And it's not just as simple as her just shoplifting. And then through deeper discussion with her lawyer, we do find out that Zoe is actually a victim of sex trafficking. And so that changes things for the defense attorney, her lawyer. And so the lawyer wants to be able to speak to the prosecutor about Zoe's case and sees what can be done to actually support Zoe and not punish her or put in a punitive measure for her, because we really want to understand that she actually is victimized by this experience. And so the system should be treating her as such. And then at the end, you can see that Zoe's reflecting on her experience and really unpacking her feelings with her other support group members. And this is an example of a breathing activity that Zoe does with her lawyer. We strategically put them in throughout the stories that kind of provide a pausing or a reflecting moment. So we hope that a young person might actually stop to do it, or of course they can continue on and read the rest of the material. And then next we have Jamie's story. So Jamie is roughly 16 years old. They are a non-binary young person. They are living in a group home. They've actually experienced trafficking in the past, and so they've been connected with a therapist. And then through living in the group home, they end up being peer recruited back into sex trafficking. And so we really have a lot of feelings there to unpack through Jamie's experience. And Jamie ends up being a victim witness in a criminal case against the trafficker. And they interact with different practitioners such as the police, prosecutor, and victim advocate. And so here's some examples from Jamie's story. So at the beginning, they're meeting with their therapist, Patricia. This story is really great because it focuses a lot on like psychosocial supports and therapy and coping strategies. And we really wanted to interweave them as much as possible and show some examples of that. So we've got Jamie speaking with their therapist over here about moving to a new group home. They've met a new friend named Gigi. We learned that Gigi herself is being exploited by her cousin and is also a victim of trafficking. And Gigi is being made by her cousin to recruit other young people to attend these parties. And so here you can see Gigi is really trying to ask Jamie to help her out and come to one of these parties. Here we can see Jamie just really conflicted about whether they should go or not. And they speak to another young person that lives in the group, her Marcus, who's also going to one of the parties. And understandably, there's a lot of complex and mixed feelings that Jamie experiences about whether they should go or not. Fast forward into the future, Jamie has attended these parties, and then fast forward many months later, there is an open criminal case against Bobby, the trafficker. And so Jamie has been brought in to talk to a detective. And here's an example of a non-trauma informed approach to talking with Jamie. And Jamie's just getting really frustrated by the detective's questioning and the way that they're approaching them. And so the conversation doesn't go too well. And then again, fast forward, we see that Jamie has been asked by prosecutors to be a victim witness in the case, and they're linked up with an advocate named Kareem. And so Kareem shows them what will happen if they attend the court, what it will be like. And here we can also see that Jamie's utilizing a journaling exercise. Brittany mentioned that as a strategy, and that's a strategy that we're showcasing here that Jamie's taken on board to help them kind of reflect and unpack the experiences they go through. And this is the end, Jamie reflecting on their experience. And so one last quote that I just wanted to share with you before I pass it on to Jasmine is that we did ask the young people again what they thought about the coping activities. You know, for us, we're social workers, so we love them, of course, but whether it would feel too much for young people or might be a little bit cheesy or just not relatable at all. And so we're really encouraged to hear these quotes. And one of them in particular is, I've always been the one growing up that's like, oh, deep breathing doesn't help, therapy doesn't help. So when I finally did get into like the residentials and stuff, and my therapist, she taught me things like breathing and grounding. Those things are things that can actually help. So it would have been beneficial to learn it at a younger age. And they all overwhelmingly said that we should definitely keep them in, add more. And so that's what we did with the final product. So I'm going to move on. Thank you so much for bearing with me for that section. I know it wasn't very interactive, but Jasmine's going to be talking now, the final section, about how to actually use the materials in your own professional roles.
Sorry, you guys, I was muted. All right, you guys. So we have given you guys so much information. We have let you know how the background of the material, how we're working with it, how our organizations are combined. Now, I would just love to give you guys just an update on how I have used it in the past, how you guys can use it, some tips, some guidelines on using the materials. Just when you use it, you're just not like a deer in headlights and you feel like you have to read through everything before you're able to use it. So just giving you like a crash course in the materials that we have. So the first thing that I would suggest is always provide the materials as early as possible. As you guys know, young people and adults alike, they sometimes do things in their own time. And providing the material earlier allows them to get it done in the time frame that they have available. Now, this is as early as possible. I do understand that some court cases are given to you with a very, very short time frame. So if you could go over it with them as early as possible, just if you have that ability to, that would be great. Also, using the activities to help the young people learn coping skills. Now, I think coping skills has been just a buzzword for the past couple of years. I don't know if it's because I'm in social work or what, but everybody understands coping skills. They all know what they are. Like Brittany and Shashika said, sometimes the coping skills, the common coping skills that are given really don't work for them, or they're just not open to doing them. So what I suggest is that, one, I love that the book gives you some coping skills to do and some activities to do. And if some of your young people are like, I don't want to do this, or this doesn't work, that opens up a discussion to come up with some type of coping skill that works better for them. So is everything in this material stuff going to work? Absolutely not. Going to work for every kid? No. But does it open a conversation to allow you to see what does work for that individual youth? Absolutely. So just being mindful of that. What is the saying? Throw the baby away with the bathwater. Don't throw everything away because one part doesn't work. Leave it as a conversation piece and always have it as a conversation piece. Also be mindful that some content may be distressing or activating to some of the youth. Now, why do we want to be mindful of that? Like Shashika said, we wanted to make the situations a lot more realistic and a lot more real to the youth. And because it's going to be real, we want to be mindful of that it may trigger something that may have happened to them or may activate an old feeling or an old memory. So when you're presenting this material, making sure that you have those things in place, you have the time in place to sit down and talk about it, to kind of review and see what's coming up. And then also to have that follow-up the next day or a couple of days after to see if anything came up afterwards. And the last one that I wanted to just point out is, and we've been kind of talking about this throughout the thing, is making sure that you're adapting the material for your local content. There's space in the material for you to add your own local resources and stuff. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but making sure that you are kind of familiar with it beforehand. So when you present it to your young person, you're able to help guide them and walk them through it. So you guys aren't going through it for the first time together. So how are we using this material? So this is one of the stories. This is Jamie's story. And what I would love to do is give you an example of how you can kind of go through it with one of your youth. I'm going to be using the assistance of Brittany and Shashika. They are going to be reading the quotes from the youth. And then I will kind of speak on after each page, advising on how I would communicate some of the information that's going on. So I believe Shashika, you're going to go first. Oh no, Brittany, you're first.
Yep. All right. So testifying wasn't as bad as I thought. I wasn't sure I'd ever testify since the case started a year and a half ago. I'm just glad I'm done with that part. The week of testifying, Kareem took me to see the courthouse. He pointed to where everyone would be and where I'd sit. He said I could look at him or Joseph if I got nervous.
Perfect. So what I would usually do is I would stop right there. The first thing I would point out is the time frame. A lot of these kids will have to testify years or just long periods of time after the event has happened. So and sometimes in my eyes as an adult, I'm just like, a year is not that big of a time, but for a youth, that is neons, that is lifetimes. Think about back when you were in high school and you had a boyfriend for 2 weeks and you were in love with him. That's a very short period of time, but for them, it was a lifetime. So understand that a year and a half for them is really going to be a lifetime. So trying to rethink of all of those things that are happening, it's going to cause some angst. It's going to cause some things that are going to come up for them. So when things like that, those are things that I want to discuss. Like, what does a year look like for you? What have you gone through in a year? How have you changed from this time to now? I also love, and I would point out of how they walk through the testimony, or they walk through the courtroom. Now, this is a luxury. Let me put this out there. This is definitely a luxury. Is every courtroom going to allow you to walk through it a couple of days before? Absolutely not. Now, are there some different options that you can go through? Yes, you can use Legos. You can use a diorama. You guys can create something together to like simulate what a courtroom looks like if you're unable to go into a courtroom. But I do suggest doing something along the courtroom so they have a visual of what it looks like. This prevents some anxiety. What will happen, or what I've been told of what happens, is that when you don't tell the information to a young person, they will try to figure it out for themselves. How do they figure it out? They usually go to social media, they go to TV. I've had a kid tell me that, like, well, I looked on Law and Order Criminal Intent, and this is how the courtroom's going to look. And now she's telling me exactly what's going to happen. And then when we go into the courtroom, it doesn't look the same. And so now she's thrown off. So we want to make sure that we really emphasize on what our courtroom looks like in our individual areas. The courtroom in LA looks different from the courtroom in Manhattan, looks different from the courtroom in Brooklyn. So we want to make sure that we kind of really specialize and simulate that to what it's going to look like for them to the best of our abilities. The last thing that I want to point out on this slide is that the idea of giving her options if she's getting nervous. So if you look at the bottom one, Kareem told her that she can look at him, or she can look at the person asking questions, or she can look somewhere else in the courtroom. We want to make sure that we just plant those seeds early on, because in the moment, a lot of their mind is going to go blank. So if we can try to plant those seeds and continuously plant those seeds as we go, they have more of an idea, or it takes them a shorter period of time of snapping out of the shock of being in court a lot sooner than if we just told them right before court, like, if you need me, look at me. Just making it more intentional. So going to the next slide. Perfect.
I'll read out this bit. So I'm being Kareem, Jamie's doing a reflection. So Joseph will ask you questions like, can you tell me how old you are? Bobby's lawyer will also ask you questions. Once they both finish asking their questions, it'll be over.
Perfect. So what Kareem is doing, and this is what we'll kind of explain in this simulation, this is a very generic thing that he is telling her. What I have used in the past is I used his words, but then I would say like how I would say it to the young person that I'm helping support. So if we're sitting in the courtroom, I may say like, hey, they're going to ask you questions. What are some questions that you think that they're going to ask? Do you want to practice answering silly questions right now while we're sitting here? So you can just get used to answering questions. So you can get used to sitting in the seat answering questions. So maybe we'll ask, who's your favorite Disney character? What did you eat yesterday? Whatever it is. Just so you take some of the angst off of being asked questions while you're sitting in that seat. And then another thing, if you notice in the depiction of the cartoon, is that Kareem is also moving around in different areas. That's also really important, because then it shows that when I'm asking you a question, if I'm telling you that it's okay to look on this side while somebody's asking you a question to your left, you don't necessarily have to look to your left. Instinctually, as humans, we want to look at the person that's talking to us. But if that is activating for them, or if that causes them more angst, we want to give them a little bit of muscle memory to let them know that they're able to look in a different direction if needed. But these are just tips that I have used. If there's tips that you have used in the past that are helpful, that's great. But I just want to give you guys a starting point. Next slide. Perfect.
All right. I was glad I got to see it beforehand, but when I walked in with the court officer, I got even more nervous. It felt like I was going on stage. We weren't able to get a closed courtroom like I wanted, but the court staff did use the right pronouns, which made me feel better. It was okay when Joseph was talking to me, but when Bobby's lawyer did, I got really nervous. He asked lots of questions that were abrupt and confusing. My face got really hot and I could feel myself talking faster.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brittany. Now, if you notice, I'm having Brittany and Shashika read out part of the material themselves. I would sometimes allow the youth to read out some of the material themselves if they feel comfortable reading. Now, let's understand that not all youth have the same comprehension level. Not all youth feel comfortable reading out loud. So if they are comfortable, this is a way to allow them to obtain or absorb the information as you go through the booklet. So you're just not talking at them, you're having a conversation with them. We would go over each slide. I would usually ask, like, what slide stood out to you the most? It could be the slide about asking about pronouns. That could spark another conversation to see, how do I make sure that my pronouns are correct when I walk into the courtroom? Maybe that's something that we can talk to the attorney or the DA about before we get into the courtroom, so they feel honored in the way that they need to feel honored. Maybe the one that sticks out to them is that I got really nervous because the lawyer is going to try to trip them up. My experience with some of the youth that I've worked with is that when we got to that point, they immediately went to law and order of like, oh, I know I'm allowed to say I plead the fifth, or I know I'm allowed to say this, or I know I'm allowed to say that. They usually have a bunch of bits of information that could or could not be true, or could not be relevant. But you want to make sure that you have, and you're opening those conversations to letting them know what they are allowed, what their rights are, and what they can and cannot say kind of in court. And then also just giving them an idea like, okay, what if somebody does shit you up? If you normally get confused when you talk to your friends and your friends are saying stuff that kind of upset you or make you upset, what do you usually do in those situations? This is not a time that I'm saying like, what coping skill are you going to use? No, I want to know what you do in those real situations, because that's usually going to be the response that you have. So now when you have that response, how can we counteract that response? What's an easier thing for you to do? Because an easier thing for them may not be to have a breathing exercise, or they can't just do a yoga pose while they're on the stand, right? So you want to see how they're going to react. So maybe that's something that you can be mindful of. And then when you have a conversation about it, it allows them to be mindful of that reaction too. So when the reaction comes up, they're just like, oh, I knew I was going to react like this. We talked about this with Jasmine. Let me take a beat. I'm going to take a breath before I answer the question. Maybe I'm going to take my time with answering the question because I want this person to wait. Whatever kind of strategy they want to come up with in their head, it's just easy to talk about it beforehand. All right, next slide. Perfect.
So I looked at Kareem and remembered his advice that all I can do is say what I know and remember about what happened. That helped. When we're getting ready to go to court, Kareem said to bring something in my pocket that would help me feel calmer. I thought that was silly at first, but it was nice to feel my grandma's necklace in my pocket when I was talking. He told me to plan something fun to do after, so I would have something to look forward to. I watched my favorite movie. It was all a blur, but then it was all done. I was happy to see Kareem afterwards and relieved it was over.
Yes. So telling them about something fun to do afterwards, that may not be plausible for a youth that may be in a care facility, or a youth that doesn't have the funds or a means to do something that they consider fun. So we need to see something that kind of uplifts them. This could be on the drive home, we can go get ice cream. This could be something as simple as you can play your favorite music in the car on the way there and on the way home. And then just having those kind of follow-up questions. I love the idea of having something textile. And again, when we tell them this, they do think that it's something silly. And if they don't bring something, it's always good just to have something on you to offer to them if they really need something. What we do is we have these little like testifying pillows that are like really tiny, but they're textile and they're soft. So if they're sitting up there, they can at least have something in their hand that they're feeling that has texture. Another one is that if you don't have time to go get a pillow, that's understandable, bring a rock. The ridges of a rock or the smoothness of a rock can also help. Because it's textile, it probably has some type of temperature. If it's cold outside, if it's warm outside, it gives them something to do with their hands. The last one is that a lot of it's going to be a blur. They're going to be super ready and pumped, or they're going to be super anxious and nervous before they go in. And then when you talk about it after, they're like, I don't even remember what I said. And that's okay. Allow them to process and allow them to kind of decompress the way that they want and they need, but just making sure that you put something in place afterwards when it doesn't become a blur, or when it kind of like really settles in of what happened in court. Perfect. So those are just some suggestions that I wanted to give you guys, to offer to you guys, to let you know how I've used the material. I would love to know if you guys have any, and you guys can write it in the chat, or you guys can unmute yourselves, whichever you feel comfortable. What strategies were used that we kind of explained to support Jamie around going to court? And then what other strategies do you think could be helpful? All right, so I'm just going to point out some strategies that we used. At any point, if you agree, if you want to chime in, unmute yourselves, give a reaction, or write something in the chat. But just the preparation, I think that is the biggest strategy that any of us can use. Is if we have time to prep for any of these cases, it's great to prep for those cases, as well as providing information for them as much as you can to allow them to I don't know what happened. To allow them to know what's going on as far advanced as possible. And I lost my Zoom. Give me a second. All right. So we just want to make sure that happens. So if you guys can think of any other strategies, that is perfect, but we just wanted to give you guys some time and space to know those. Next slide. The next one, what is in the material? So we talked about this, Shashika talked a lot about what's in the materials, but things that you can use. There's definitions, there's examples of courtrooms if you can't get into the courtroom. There's roles of everybody that's in the courtroom, and it explains what it is to open those conversations. And then there's additional information if they are foreign national minors. Next one. Perfect. And this is an example, and you've seen this throughout the presentation, is what the booklet looks like and how it's available. It tells you what's going on in the booklet. I love this because it also gives you, if you're a victim of crime, you have the rights. So if you don't know the rights, it allows you to know what the rights are and what it looks like for each individual. And again, these are going to be really lengthy. These also, like I said, it tells you who's in the court, what they could look like. This could be a jury. And then what's their purpose. Now, this is a great conversational piece because they may say, well, I don't like the way this person looked at me, or I don't like the way this person looks, or all these people look different. Explaining what a jury is and what their purpose is super helpful, but it gives you a really in-depth definition of what they are and who they are. Again, an example of what a courtroom looks like. Now, for California, this is not exactly what a courtroom looks like, but we can kind of alter and adjust. So they give you a very general look of what a courtroom looks like, and then you can kind of point out where everything is for them as well. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is just feedback from young survivors. So at the end of the books, putting in like hotlines, resources to call when you're in trouble, I think that would be a good thing to do. They said we listened. So we provided space at the end of the booklet for you to make it individualized, for you to make sure that it belongs to them, so you can put your own local resources. So this is where you would put the advocate's number, maybe the therapist's number, maybe local law enforcement or local shelters or local support systems that they can have as well. So the booklet is able to be adjusted for the area that you're in. And now, so in case you guys are just like, great job, Jasmine, I don't remember anything that you said, it's completely fine. There is also a practitioner and caregiver's guide to going through the graphic novels that we just showed you. What does it do? It allows you to have another like seminar like this that kind of goes through the material, see what it's like, seeing how you can not only train yourselves, but maybe training your staff on how to use the material that's in there. So we're trying to really cut down and really help you guys use the material in the best way possible. So we also inserted just a guide on how you can use it and how you can use it to support trafficking survivors. Now, the next thing, we understand that trafficking survivors are not only in English, so we are trying to translate in all these other different languages. So if you have victims that are that speak different languages or are multi-language, it's really great to have things in their native language so they feel a lot more comfortable and they understand what's going on. Another thing that we are mindful of that we had feedback about is that we wanted to make sure that there's possibly audiobook recordings of these things. Why do we need this? Because again, the comprehension level of some youth may not be the same as others, and we want to make sure that everybody's able to receive the information in an equal way. So another thing, this is one thing that I really love. I got to spend some time with some young adults and we got to listen to these podcasts. Now, if reading and booklets are not in for some of the youth that you guys serve, maybe listening to a podcast would. So there's a podcast that is led by a young lady that has been impacted by exploitation and trafficking, and she talks very raw about some of the things that happened to her while she was in the court system, and how she felt, what she wanted, what she may have needed in those areas. So we wanted to give you guys access to these podcasts. It's a series. It's phenomenal. And if you're just riding in the car and the conversation is a little too hard to talk about, these are great conversational starters to play in your car while you guys are driving to an appointment or anything like that. Now you guys have access to this. So you guys will have this recording, but if you guys are a QR code type of person, take a picture of this slide really quick, because this is how you can get access to the podcast as well as the supportive material. All of this is available online. If you happen to forget what organizations that we're from, you can just take a quick picture of this, and these QR codes will lead you to all the materials or the podcast that we have. So this is the discussion question that I would like you guys just to ponder on as we conclude this presentation. How might you utilize these materials and supportive strategies in your work? Now, I would love to know how you would utilize them individually or how you would utilize them as a team. Now, here in California, we work in multidisciplinary teams. So maybe I'm not the person that's going to be talking about this stuff, but the attorney is, or the social worker, or the DPO is. Making sure that now that you guys have the information, you guys are able to share that information to who's ever on the team that is best fit to discuss this with the youth. Ponder on it, let it simmer, let it, sink in, see where it works best. But definitely would love to, if you guys have any follow-up questions, you can go to the next slide. You can reach out to either of all three of us about how to use it, what the material is, how it's working in your systems and our systems, and how we can maybe improve it if we ever make another one. So these are our contact information. Reach out to us if you need to. And then I'm going to pass it back to Lenore if you guys have any questions.
Thank you so much. What an incredible presentation. Just even being years in this work, I feel like I gained so much more knowledge and information. So I want to do a special thank you to Brittany, Shashika, Jasmine. This was incredible. Everyone that is on the call, please head over to the chat and please do your evaluation for this great presentation that we had. Thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day. Bye.